Hello, and welcome to Andy Fancher Presents, where today we meet a heroic 92-year-old World War II veteran by the name of Carl Matthews, whom at the age of 16 enrolled into the Marine Corps to help broaden his opportunities. We meet in his Cedar Hill, Texas home, where he tells us the remainder of his fantastic story. Are you a believer now?
Am I a believer?
Yes.
Yes. I grew up in a very conservative religious arena. Actually, I went to the seminary and received 2 degrees. And I actually pastored churches. But over the years, my theology began to change because I began to see other things. In fact, even when I was in the seminary, I began to question some of the things that were thrown at me. So today, my theology has narrowed. I have 3 points. The first point of my theology is God is love. The second point is God is practical. And the third point is do unto others. And I let the great theologians worry about all these many denominational differences that shatter almost and separate religions. I was born in Corsicana, Texas in 1924. I want you to know I lived through the Great Depression. My dad had lost his business at the early part of the Depression. I knew I wanted to go to school, but I couldn't see how I'd ever go to college. I had been making 10 cents an hour working at the store, and when the man came and offered me a job with the Marine Corps at $21 a day, once a month, I was elated. The next thing I knew, we were sitting in my mother and daddy's, in my family's living room, and he was talking to my parents, but he had all the papers ready to sign and left those with, and very reluctantly my mother and father signed those papers. And the next thing I knew, I was off to Waco and then on interurban to Dallas, and from Dallas to San Diego to the Marine boot camp. And I was so excited about getting to San Diego and getting into my new uniform and marching to the bands and going to the rifle range. So we got into boot camp, and I thought it was great. I weighed 123 pounds. I was just barely 17 years old. And I had 3 meals a day. And we got to march behind the band. I thought this was great. Some of the guys fussed about it, but I thought it was wonderful. After boot camp, I was assigned to the 8th Marine Regiment at Camp Elliott, which was not too far from San Diego. And everything was fine. I got paid $21 a month, 10 of which went home. I did not go on liberty one time. So much was happening on the Marine base that I enjoyed. Pearl Harbor came, and the world changed. One day, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, the 8th Regiment, which had been turned into the 2nd Marine Brigade, departed for Samoa. And on January the 20th, 1942, we arrived at Pago Pago. And we were told that the Japanese were expected to attack at any minute. And fortunately, they never did arrive. But after several months, I contacted some type of a disease that's still undiagnosed. And they couldn't control it. So finally, a Navy oil tanker came through from Australia, going back to the States. And I was able to get on that and come back home. After I got out of the hospital, I worked for a while at the office at base headquarters, and then went to the combat training school and eventually assigned to the 4th Marine Division, which at that time was stationed at Camp Pendleton, which was between San Diego and Los Angeles.
In the Central Pacific, the Marshall Islands constituted a block in the path of the U.S. drive westward.
In January of 1944, we sailed from San Diego when we attacked the Marshall Islands, which was the first Japanese-held territory to be attacked, and the longest shore-to-shore invasion in history.
The 4th Marine Division went into action for the first time. Most of the men had arrived only recently from Marine training camps in the United States. The main objectives were 3 small islands.
We had hit the island of Roy. We had 1 man killed out of our company and several wounded.
The dead would not be forgotten by the men who had fought with them side by side.
After the Marshalls, we went to Maui to recuperate and mostly to train. We had very little recuperation, believe me. And we stayed there until May, when our company was loaded on an LST at the harbor at Kahului and sailed over to what they call the West Loch area of Pearl Harbor, where ships were just everywhere. I had gone to a baseball game ashore, and I heard this explosion. I looked out in the area of our LSTs, and there was a huge plume of smoke. And then there was another explosion. The game was stopped, and we were told to fall out in the parking lot, which we did, and told us there had been an accident and that we would have to stay in some tents until things were cleaned up. About 2 days later, they announced that we could go back, and that was when we learned that 6 of those LSTs had sunk as a result of explosions and a loss of life of over 500 Marines and sailors and Army and civilians. That story was not circulated in the press until 1960 because of the seriousness of it. After the explosion of the LSTs, those LSTs that remained sailed for the Marshalls, and there we formed the largest amphibious group in history, and we sailed for Saipan. It seemed that it took about 2 weeks from the Marshalls to get to Saipan. It was a long time, and we rode that out on the LSTs. On the night before we hit Saipan, some of us were up on the top deck and playing fiddle and guitar and singing, and at the close they began to sing hymns. One by one, the guys would request that we play one hymn, then another. Afterwards, one young man came up to me and he said, "Thank you for having this." He said, "I felt like I had been to church." If that were true, a lot of those boys never went to church, and that was their last church service. The next morning we got into amphibious tractors that were down in the hold of the LST and rolled out the front of the LST into the water early in the morning. And about 8 o'clock we began to form a line parallel to the beach.
Saipan was the Japs' nerve center. Its capital and largest city was Garapan, the second biggest city, Charankanoa.
We reached the Saipan beach at the little town of Charankanoa about 8:30. But before we got to the beach, the Japanese artillery began to shell the incoming amphibious tractors. I saw one that just had a direct hit and it just disintegrated. When we got to the beach, pandemonium broke out. The shells were coming to the right and to the left and back out in the water and in the trees in front of us. And the lieutenant was yelling, "Get off the beach, boys, get off the beach." But before we got off the beach, a young man by the name of Winnikins was hit with a sniper. He died immediately. And I remember this little boy from New York by the name of Marrero, an incoming amphibious tractor hit him, knocked him down, ran over his legs. And I thought he was gone, but I later saw him at the hospital in Oakland. That was the beginning of 24 days of hell. We crossed the island. They gave us a new assignment, and we were placed in the center of the island, which was very mountainous. And we began to make our way north through an area which I termed the Devil's Backbone, because it was rugged, and some days we couldn't see the ocean from either side. We were down inside the mountains. Over those 24 days, 40 of our 283 men died. I have no idea how many men were wounded. Some of them were wounded twice. I stayed 23 days, and on the morning of July the 8th, there was a big bonsai attack that started on the north end of the island. 4,000 to 5,000 Japanese soldiers, some armed with nothing more than sharp stick, began to advance south down the beach. And they went through 2 army units, through a Marine group, and were finally stopped when Marine artillery firing at fractions of a second finally stopped them, and with some black Marines. Many of those survivors retreated back north to an area called San Roque. And above San Roque was a cliff that was filled with hundreds of caves that had been formed in the molten lava. And we were ordered out of the mountains to come to the top of that cliff and go down and flush those survivors out, many of whom were wounded. Our company went down, our platoon, led by Lieutenant James Stanley Jr. of Pahosky, North Carolina, went down about 30 feet. We were in the lead, and the other terrain was so difficult they couldn't move fast, and they asked us to stop. Lieutenant Leary and I were sitting on a rock. I was his runner, and I was with him all the time. And we were talking about the fact that it looked like the Japanese had just about had it, that the battle was almost over. And I looked through my binoculars, and I could see 6 or 7 Japanese officers about 900 yards to the right. As Lieutenant Leary stood, shots rang out, and he was hit. And we both fell to the ground, and I reached over and touched him, and I knew he was dead. And I didn't realize it, but I had suffered from concussion, and my eardrum was ruptured. And as my brain began to swell, my memory began to cease to function. And after the lieutenant died, I just went out of it completely. I woke up 8 days later on a hospital ship, and the war was over. So I came home and spent a few weeks of duty at Quantico, and was then given a medical discharge and sent home. I had been on 2 overseas Pacific tours of duty, 2 invasions, had a Purple Heart, and I was back home in Hubbard, Texas, still too young to buy beer. Well, I certainly didn't win the war, so I can't be remembered for that. But I was there. And I think I did my part as best I knew how and the best I could. I've enjoyed everything I've done. I've had some great experiences and still have great experiences. So life has been good. And I've met so many wonderful people. And I'm still meeting wonderful people.